Hi, everyone. So I am going to get started. More people will be joining us, but it is time. Firstly, I'd like to welcome you to this talk on behalf of the Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies at the University of British Columbia. The university is located on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam people from where I'm speaking to you today. Although this talk is taking place in virtual space and connecting the Pacific Northwest with California and all of us from all points in between and around, I'd like us all to take a moment to reflect on the space that we ourselves occupy and its provenance. This talk is part of our Slavchin lecture series in Slavic studies. For more information about the talks being held in our department, please follow us on Twitter at CNESUBC or visit our website, cnes.ubc.ca. The next talk in the Slavchin series will be by Dr. Łukasz Schultz of Sheffield University and will take place at 11 a.m. next Thursday. Today's talk is co-sponsored by the North American Dostoevsky Society, and we are grateful for their support. To learn more about the activities of the North American Dostoevsky Society, you can visit our blog, bloggerskaramazov.com, or our website, dostoevsky.org. For today's talk, I will be moderating questions. This is a Zoom webinar, so you can post your questions in the Q&A function and we'll address them after the talk, or you can write your questions directly in the chat. If you raise your hand after the talk, we can also do that, but we will not be taking questions or addressing questions until the end of the talk. It is my great pleasure to introduce today's guest, Dr. Vadim Shneyder. Vadim Shneyder is a good friend of mine and an assistant professor of Russian in the Department of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian Languages and Cultures at UCLA. He is the author of Russia's Capitalist Realism, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, and Chekhov, which came out with Northwestern University Press in 2020. And he's also written numerous articles on 19th and 20th century Russian literature and aesthetic theory. He is currently editing a special issue of the journal Russian Literature about forgotten and neglected authors, forms, and genres in Russian literature of the Age of Realism. Dr. Shneyder also serves as Secretary-Treasurer of the North American Dostoevsky Society. Today, Dr. Shneyder will present on Dostoevsky's Capitalist Realism, or Why Money Does Not Burn in the Idiot.
All right. Thank you very much for the introduction. Professor Bowers, it's an honor to be here and to take part in the Slavchin lecture series. I am grateful to the Department of Central, Eastern, and Northern European Studies at UBC for hosting my talk, and to the North American Dostoevsky Society for co-sponsoring it. I look forward to discussing my research with you all today. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for joining. I have a few slides to share, so I'm going to share my screen now, and hopefully you will see what I intend for you to see. Here we are. My talk, as Dr. Bowers has said, is Dostoevsky's Capitalist Realism, or Why Money Does Not Burn in the Idiot. As a kind of preface to my discussion of Fyodor Dostoevsky's novel, The Idiot, I want to say a few things to situate my argument, to explain why I have chosen to talk about Dostoevsky and Russian realism the way that I have. About a year ago, I published a book called Russia's Capitalist Realism. And in a nutshell, that book proposes that we read the tradition of Russian literary realism in a somewhat unfamiliar way, with particular emphasis on that literature's response to economic change. Doing this, I argue, reveals things that readers have not often noticed, even in major works that are not obviously connected to economic change. It even allows us to understand some of the most famous scenes in Russian literature, like Nastasia Filipovna's name day party in The Idiot, for example, in new ways. I try to show that Russian realist literature was responding to the emergence of early capitalism. But that said, if we look at the major works of the Russian literary tradition, we won't see the industrial landscapes of Dickens or, let's say, the giant department stores of Emile Zola. Capitalism, the Russia of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, looked different, and indeed so did the conventions of writing novels. There exists a rich scholarly tradition that links the emergence of the realist novel in the West with the emergence of the commercially active middle class. In this sense, capitalism and the realist novel go hand in hand. The Russian Empire did not have the kind of robust, self-conscious middle class that Great Britain did, nor did it attain the level of industrialization of Great Britain or Germany in the 19th century. Instead of a basis in the rising bourgeoisie, Russian realism was a literature primarily of and about the gentry and their predominantly agrarian lives. But if we look over the great Russian novels, we see again and again that this way of life is threatened. Storm clouds are gathering on the horizon. The estates are in financial trouble. The more conscious or conscientious members of the nobility are tormented by a feeling of stuckness. One way to read these tensions and anxieties, of course, is to look ahead to the three revolutions of the early 20th century, which culminated in the destruction of the old regime and a concerted effort to build an entirely different society. But there was plenty to worry about even without the specter of communism. The world of Turgenev's or Tolstoy's novels might seem utterly old-fashioned, and indeed Anna Karenina was criticized for being out of sync with its times. But the authors of these novels, as well as the editors who published them and the readers who read them, often cared a great deal about the developments in the West and about the meaning of those developments for Russia. If you open a journal like Ruski Vestnik, the Russian Messenger, and much of the canon of Russian realism was published in this single journal, you will find alongside novels by the major writers, a plethora of book chapters, articles, essays, poems, and memoirs on the most diverse topics, including with considerable prominence analysis of news from around the world and discussion of economic matters at home and abroad. Russian readers were eager to learn about developments elsewhere, particularly in the West, because those developments might point to where Russia would go in the future. If all nations followed the same immutable laws of economic and social development as some thinkers held, then looking to the West was indeed a look into the future. But if Russia's path was different, and if people had some agency in their historical development, then perhaps Russia could avoid disasters like the ones that some observers saw taking place in Europe, such as the dissolution of traditional social bonds, the emergence of an impoverished, deracinated, and radicalized proletariat, and the triumph of greed over all other values. Russia's backwardness in this sense conferred an advantage of perspective. It gave Russia, at least potentially, a kind of historical self-awareness that a country that was at the tip of time's arrow couldn't have. This is one reason why I think some of the major Russian novels of this period devote so much space to testing out various ideas and envisioning where those ideas might lead. When we read the great Russian realist novels in isolation from all these other texts and discussions, their commentary on and interventions in those discussions become easier to miss. But when we read the major writers together with all those other texts, including second-rate topical novels, I think we see a lot more clearly just how closely connected the novels of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky were to the major questions of their time, including economic questions. I don't think that this kind of contextual reading is a narrowly academic exercise either. If we take The Idiot as being, among other things, an attempt to adapt the form of the novel to a pace and rhythm of a changing social and economic, social system, I should say, an economic way of life, we may learn something about the huge transformations that took place starting in the 19th century and that made our world the way it is. So that is the historical part of the argument. But I'm talking about works of literature that belongs to a certain tradition with its conventions and its constraints. How can a realist novel respond to the emergence of capitalism? My interest here is not limited to themes that appear in these novels. It is also a matter of form, of how the novels are put together, how narrative alternates with description, how time moves, how space is imagined. With that in mind, I'd like to foreground one of my basic contentions in this talk as much as in my book, and that is that it is difficult to write about capitalism within the constraints of the 19th century realist novel. It's possible that this is more the case in Russia than elsewhere because Russian capitalism seemed to look different, or at least its discursive representations did. When it arrives in the novels of Tolstoy and Dostoevsky, it does so in the form of millionaire bankers in big factories rather than neighborhood shops. and familiar local merchants. Is it different in the British or French or German traditions? I think in some ways it is, but perhaps that is something that specialists in other literatures who are in the audience can comment on in the Q&A, if there is interest. I suspect that some of the problems are common to realist novels across languages, but at the very least in the Russian case, there are various reasons why capitalism is hard to accommodate in the realist novel. At the same time, though, it is impossible to avoid trying to deal with capitalism because its emergence was so striking, so disturbing, evidently so threatening to the existing order. In these novels, railroads are already making incursions into quiet gentry estates. Merchants are coming to buy up forests from indebted landowners. Peasants are crossing the countryside and entering cities and factories in search of work. The world is changing too much for the realist novel to ignore. This all becomes truly central to the literature of the end of the 19th century in the stories and plays of Chekhov and the novels and stories and plays of Gorky, as well as a host of less familiar writers. But the beginnings are already evident decades earlier. As processes of production grow ever more complex, encompassing national and even global economic networks, they become harder to write about. How do you explain all of this complexity to a non-specialist audience while focusing on individual characters and their stories as not a realist novels generally do? Perhaps you could give your reader massive and authoritative descriptions of how things work. But this invites criticism that your novel is misshapen, prone to tangents and irrelevant detail. Critics will complain about just that tendency as it develops in Russian literature later in the century in the age of Chekhov. In any case, this approach leads us in the direction of the naturalist novel, as exemplified by Zola in France, where the descriptions seem to take on a power of their own, forming a kind of counterweight to the movement of plot. Another approach is to write a totally different kind of narrative, foregrounding processes in things instead of people. We find a remarkable early example of this in a story by Herman Melville called The Paradise of Bachelors and Tartarus of Maids in 1855, which is more about the production of paper and the global movement of commodities than it is about people. But this is again a precursor for a different kind of literature. It adumbrates the naturalist novel in which, as the critic and People's Commissar of Education in the early Soviet state, Anatoly Lunacharsky put it, quote, if the sausage maker makes sausage, then sausage also makes the sausage maker, end of quote. That kind of focus on process and things rather than humans also points toward modernist experiments in replacing the novel with new narrative forms that would correspond to technological and economic developments that exceeded human scale. Another difficulty, economic transformation foregrounds changes in the ways and the reasons that people work. But work is also hard to write about. It is poised awkwardly between narration and description, between progress and repetition. One moment in the work process, one description of a few minutes of work does not capture what work really is, as the theorist Elaine Scarry has observed. Capitalism introduces new kinds of workspaces like the factory, but factories too are difficult to describe. They are too complicated, too deafening for the uninitiated visitor, and too boring, too monotonous and repetitious from the point of view of the worker. And if the spatial extent and temporality of industry and big business are so great that they challenge the basically biographical form of the novel, then financial transactions pose their own problems. How do you write about economic processes that lack the empirical qualities and subjective experiences that novels excelled at representing, for which techniques had been in development over long centuries? Business, when it is going well, strikes many 19th century writers as impossibly boring. Nothing happens. Money is made. Only disasters are eventful enough to mention. Only criminals are exciting enough to write about, like Chichikov in Gogol's Dead Souls. Again, Zola here provides an impressive solution to the problem. He writes a whole novel about banks and stocks, money of 1895. His narrator explains the details of various financial operations to the reader. But this is a novel about colossal ambition and ruthless criminality. It is about the extraordinary rise and calamitous fall of a larger-than-life figure. One Russian text, a satire by Mikhail Saltykov-Щедрин called A Contemporary Idyll, Современная идиллия, transforms this purported emptiness of the businessman's ordinary life into a clever narrative effect. When a merchant is asked to tell the story of his life, he produces a register of transactions. But even here, the humorous effect comes from the fact that most of these transactions are ludicrously criminal. One of the reasons I want to focus on The Idiot is that it has some successful businessmen in it, people who do not become embroiled in scandal and whose fortunes don't go up in flames. They are never found guilty or punished for their crimes, their schemes are not exposed, and they don't commit suicide or get exiled to Siberia. They just keep going, and so do their businesses. These are peripheral characters, to be sure, but they shape the novel in very interesting ways, as I will try to show in the rest of this talk. So with that, let's proceed to Dostoevsky and The Idiot specifically. The first thing to say is that many readers of Dostoevsky have noted his evident fascination with money, but have emphasized, in my opinion, overemphasized its abnormality in his works, the way that people do weird, non-economic things with it. One of the exemplary scenes of that odd behavior will be the centerpiece of my talk. But my claim is that a close look at the scene and how it fits into the novel shows us that Dostoevsky also grappled with the problem of how to represent the more rational kind of money user. The title of my talk is thus Dostoevsky's Capitalist Realism, or Why Money Does Not Burn in the Idiot. My goal is to convince you that there is great significance in something that doesn't happen in this novel, that the significance extends beyond the idiot to the ways that the Russian realist novel imagined the capitalist future and its own limits in making that future legible. And to see how all of this works, we need to begin at the very end of the novel. By the time that readers finish the last chapter of The Idiot, the three most important characters are all gone. Prince Myshkin, Dostoevsky's attempt to create a novelistic hero who would be, in the author's words, quote, a totally beautiful person, полностью прекрасный человек, end of quote, has gone mad. After hundreds of pages in which the prince's attempts to bring goodness into the lives of the other characters have led to total failure, Myshkin succumbs to one final catastrophe. In the end, he is shuffled off into the care of a certain Dr. Shneyder in Switzerland, to whom, of course, I bear no relation, where the basic mystery of the prince's nature, that is, his metaphysical suspension between mid-19th century St. Petersburg and some kind of unearthly realm, is removed in favor of an ineluctable medical diagnosis, quote, absolute damage to his intellectual organs, end quote. The prince's story is over. The immediate cause of his deterioration is the murder of the novel's central object of fascination, the beautiful and enigmatic Nastasia Filipovna. Finally, her killer, the rich merchant Rogozhin, has confessed and been sentenced to a term of hard labor in Siberia. In Dostoevsky's previous novel, Crime and Punishment, we had followed Raskolnikov to Siberia, but here, while Rogozhin's life goes on, his story is over. So Nastasia Filipovna is dead, and Rogozhin and Myshkin have been reduced to a condition that apparently does not support narration. Nothing more of note will happen to them. The novel's last chapter is structured like an epilogue. It seems designed to give us some sense of what the characters do after the end of the main story. However, it would seem that there is actually nothing to say about the three most important figures in this novel. Instead, we get a few details about the continuing lives of some of the other characters. We learn, for example, about the Yepanchin family, including their youngest daughter's sham marriage to a Polish charlatan, as if Dostoevsky cannot end the novel without a last bit of nationalist posturing. As for everyone else, the narrator basically shrugs as he goes through the list of secondary characters. Quote, Lebedev, Keller, Ganya, and Ptitsin, among other characters in our story, are living as before, have changed little, and we have almost nothing to relate about them, end of quote. What is the point of telling us that there is nothing to tell? Well, I think that the point comes down to the difference between those who go on living as before, their lives changing little, and those who have been ejected from the space of the novel's narrative. The difference between the fates of the Yapanchins and their associates on the one hand, and Rogozhin and Myshkin on the other, is a narrative expression of the difference in their places in the novel's economic imaginary, in which some people have a future and others don't. This difference, finally, has a lot to do with the forms of money with which these characters are associated. The reason I have chosen to begin this talk with the ending of The Idiot is because I think this strange final chapter illuminates an important facet of the novel, and one which has not received the scholarly attention it deserves. It is hard not to notice that money suffuses Dostoevsky's fictions, but many readers have focused on the ways in which these sums deviate from some putative standard of economic normalcy. The classic formulation of this idea comes in George Steiner's book, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky, and I want to share a key quotation with you in the slide. So here, Steiner writes, Raskolnikov desperately needs a certain number of rubles, as does Dmitry Karamazov. And it is perfectly true that Rogozhin's fortune plays a vital role in The Idiot, but the money is never earned in any clearly definable manner. It does not entail the attenuating routine of a profession or the disciplines of usury upon which Balzac's financiers expend their powers. Dostoevsky's characters, even the neediest among them, always have leisure for chaos or an unpremeditated total involvement. They are available day and night. No one need go and ferret them out of a factory or an established business. Above all, their use of money is strangely symbolic and oblique, like that of kings. They burn it or wear it over their hearts. End of quote. This passage contains several productive observations about the leisure for chaos that Dostoevsky's characters require, and about the attenuating routine of work, which seems to present a representational challenge in a great deal of modern narrative fiction. Indeed, it would seem that many of Dostoevsky's characters have to be liberated from work so that they can find time for their philosophical disquisitions and their peripatetic urban reveries. Furthermore, the idea that Dostoevsky's characters do not work goes hand in hand with the notion that their uses of money are abnormal. But there is one immediate problem with Steiner's claim, one which I will argue has important consequences for our understanding of how money works in Dostoevsky's novels, and more broadly, how the Russian realist novel attempted to represent something as elusive as the gradual arrival of capitalism. The problem with this passage I just quoted is that the money that Steiner claims Dostoevsky's characters burn doesn't actually burn. Indeed, its refusal to burn will be of key importance to my talk today. But before I get to that, probably the most important scene in The Idiot, I want to lay out my argument a little bit more fully. And for that, I will need to come back to the novel's strange ending. So it is my contention that the abrupt cessation of all narratively meaningful events at the end of the novel can be explained by the conclusion of a struggle that takes place throughout the hundreds of preceding pages between two groups of rich men. On the one hand, there are backward but fascinating merchants. On the other, modern but boring capitalists. The rich men who vie for control of Nastasia Filipovna generally fall into these two categories, based on their biographies, the sources of their wealth, and the degree to which their money is linked to the growing world of joint stock companies, industrialization, and investments. While the capitalists earn their money by means of various business ventures and gain social status through their successful investments, the merchants attempt to keep their fortunes sequestered within their families and transfer wealth through inheritance. The sums of money that appear in The Idiot bear traces of their origins wherever they circulate. In my remaining time, I will track the movement of the inherited money of the merchants and show that it proves very difficult to spend and also unprofitable to those who possess it. Both of the prominent characters associated with the merchantry, Rogozhin, as I will argue, Myshkin too, benefit very little from their money and ultimately end up penniless. Moreover, Myshkin's fate mirrors Rogozhin's in that both end up exiled from Russia with their narratable lives effectively over, while the capitalists Trotsky and Yapanchin continue living their successful professional and social lives beyond the concluding chapter. The novel thus offers its prognosis of Russia's economic future by eliminating the merchants and providing the capitalist entrepreneurs with an unobstructed path to continued success, although it does not follow them into this future, which appears to lie beyond the limits of what the novel can narrate. But I want to stress one point here, to which I will return at the end. The story that this novel tells of the struggle between merchants and capitalists should not be taken as a kind of factual report on Russia's real economic development in the late 1860s. Indeed, numerous commentators on Russia's economic transformation, whether urban physiologists or writers of fiction, described the growing power of the merchants as this traditional estate took advantage of the expansion of commercial opportunities in the years following the great reforms and the emancipation of the serfs. Instead, I think that Dostoevsky's novel is exploring its own limits here. The successful capitalists suggest an economic future for Russia. What is it possible to say about this future? What kind of shape will history assume once their triumph is complete? And what is the place of the realist novel in telling that story? If the conclusions are rather pessimistic in The Idiot, I think this is in part because Dostoevsky and his contemporaries were proceeding into uncharted conceptual territory. The world that was just coming into view for them is long familiar to us and might seem unremarkable. I claim that Dostoevsky's novel tries to deal with capitalism, but the very word capitalism was not in wide circulation in Russia, nor was it, I think, anywhere in the 1860s. It starts to appear in theoretical works in Russian only in the following decades, which also brings Marxist theory to Russia for the first time. Moreover, the concept of the national economy is not generally available either. The idea that there is this thing called the economy that consists of the totality of economic relationships, that this thing has a history, that it is supposed to grow forever and thus ensure the well-being of the population, this idea, which is ubiquitous today, was only in the process of being defined in Dostoevsky's time. If you look in reference works and encyclopedias, it is only at the end of the century, the end of the 19th century, that is, that the term народное хозяйство, national economy, makes an appearance in that modern sense. Here I'll quote the economic historian Adam Tooze on this matter, discussing the European context. He writes, quote, "The economy is not pre-existing reality, an object which we simply observe and theorize about. Our understanding of the economy as a distinct entity, a distinct social sphere or social system, is the product of a dramatic process of imaginative abstraction and representational labor," end of quote. The realist novel was not taking up a readily available concept of economy and using it to create stories about contemporary life. It was actually part of this representational labor of making the concept of the national economy in the first place. So with that in mind, I want to turn to the scene at the end of part 1 of The Idiot, where a large group of characters have gathered at the name day party of Nastasia Filipovna, a beautiful but unpredictable woman who is the main object of desire for many of the male characters in this novel. Several of the guests at this party eagerly anticipate her announcement of whether or not she will agree to marry an ambitious young man named Ganya. This would be particularly advantageous, we learn, for one of the novel's capitalists, a man named Trotsky. We are led to understand that this Trotsky had raped the adolescent Nastasia Filipovna, and now he would like to avoid any scandals that might erupt from her revealing this fact. So, having consulted with the novel's other capitalist, his friend General Yapanchin, Trotsky offers 75,000 rubles, a very large sum, to Ganya in order to, quote, buy Ganya by selling him Nastasia Filipovna as a lawful wife, end of quote. The problem with this plan is that Rogozhin an heir to an enormous merchant fortune, is also in love with Nastasia Filipovna and barges in on this party. Rogozhin bursts through the door holding a strange object in his hands. The narrator describes it in the following terms, quote, "It was a big stack of paper about 5 inches high and 7 inches long, wrapped firmly and closely in the stock exchange news, and tied very tightly on all sides and twice crisscrossed with the kind of string used for tying sugar loaves." End of quote. We will soon discover that what is contained in this newspaper is a stack of 1,100 ruble bills, which Rogozhin, the son of a rich merchant, was able to borrow at the last minute. The bundle of cash wrapped in the stock exchange news is a complicated object. One of the major sources of financial news in 1860s Russia, the stock exchange news allowed a reader in St. Petersburg to learn about economic processes taking place all over the empire. The newspaper contained the latest information from the growing number of Russian regional trading floors, such as commodity prices, as well as other important information for mid-19th century investors. So this is a page from the January 1st, January 3rd issue from 1868, announcing the winners from the January 2nd drawing of lottery bonds. This is an example of the kind of thing that you can read in the stock exchange news. So, as I said, for example, a reader in January 1868, when the serialization of The Idiot began in the Russian Messenger, could look at this table listing the winners in the January 2nd drawing of lottery bonds. Lottery bonds were a kind of government bond issued in the Russian Empire and in many other countries as a way to stimulate investment, to encourage people to purchase bonds. They had a nominal value and a regular rate of return, just like a regular government bond, but they were also entered into a lottery. The lucky holder of a bond with the right serial number could win far more than the bond was worth. In this table, which is probably not legible on your screen, but if one looks closely, we can see that a 100 ruble investment could conceivably yield a 200,000 ruble return, a colossal sum conjured up seemingly out of nowhere. The only thing a bondholder would need in order to receive this money was luck. But that winning sum, while huge, is just a figure in a chart. What Rogozhin drops on the table is far more striking in its obdurate materiality. Its dimensions are carefully enumerated, and even the manner in which it is held together receives attention. The reader can almost feel the weight of the package as Rogozhin places it on the table. Unlike the sums of capital discussed on the pages of the stock exchange news, this money is undeniably physically present in the scene and will exert a hypnotic power over the people assembled in the room. The guests gaze at the bundle of money in fascination, especially when Nastasia Filipovna orders that it be thrown into the blazing fireplace. However, the money doesn't burn. We read, quote, "The outer paper was nearly all charred and smoldering, but it could be seen at once that the inside was not damaged. The packet had been wrapped in 3 layers of newspaper, and the money was untouched." End of quote. The stock exchange news, with its facts and figures and charts about the national economy, has been burned away, and all that remains is the merchant's pile of cash. The narrative is distended by the characters' prolonged emotional reactions to the burning package as it seems to linger in the flames. Yet, despite the perceived span of time when it is finally pulled out of the fire, the money is almost unharmed. Quote, "Maybe just 1 little thousand is damaged a tiny bit, but the rest is untouched," notes one of the guests. The physical presence of the money induces very powerful emotions in the gathered characters and in Ganya in particular. After the package is hurled at his feet, he faints, and the 100,000 rubles suddenly disappear from the novel. No further mention is made of them for hundreds of pages until the beginning of part 4, but the sub lingers on in the margins of the narrative. While the characters, and likely the reader too, are fascinated by this spectacle, Totsky, eager to avoid embarrassment, quietly makes his exit. And in leaving the party, he tiptoes out of the novel as well. But we are not done with Totsky and will return to him later. For now, however, I want to focus on the money. Just before Rogozhin produces his bundle of cash, Nastasia Filipovna refuses the offer of 75,000 offered by Totsky if she marries Ganya. But that money, described as capital, is not present in this scene. It is invisible money. The existence of financial institutions is its condition of possibility, and given the normal functioning of those institutions, it exists virtually and thus cannot be thrown into a fire. In contrast, Rogozhin's bundle, passed between two characters who are far removed from utilitarian calculation, is decidedly not capital, and the novel seems to offer no possibility that it will ever be spent. When it is saved from the flames, the entire sum goes to Ganya, who, against his own acquisitive nature, returns it to Myshkin. The prince, it is implied, returns it to Nastasia Filipovna, who, the narrative has made quite clear, will not use the money that she has failed to destroy. So, as the narrator puts it, the bundle is, quote, thrown to Ganya by a mad woman to whom it has also been brought by a madman, end of quote. It thus manages to circulate without being exchanged for anything, not given as a gift, but passed on because it is unwanted. Having survived the fire, the money continues a kind of ghostly circulation outside of economic transactions because, being invested with the desires and defiant pride of Rogozhin, Nastasia Filipovna, and Ganya, it can no longer be equivalent to anything else. Wherever it goes, it retains a connection to its source, the pathologically passionate Rogozhin, who has invested it with an incalculable emotional value. Over the course of the novel, it becomes clear that Rogozhin is nothing like the nondescript capitalists, Trotsky and Yapanchin. As the most prominent representative of the merchantry in the novel, Rogozhin exemplifies the characteristics of that estate with its cultural conservatism and emotional investment in money. Introducing the Rogozhin family home, the narrator observes that it has proven peculiarly resistant to the rapid transformation of the St. Petersburg cityscape. Of the old houses like the one Rogozhin's family has long inhabited, a few, quote, built at the end of the last century, have survived precisely on these Petersburg streets where everything changes so quickly, almost without change, end of quote. The exterior of the house seems to stand outside of historical time, while the interior, in its gloomy and disordered stability, is a kind of metonym of its inhabitants. Myshkin observes to Rogozhin that, quote, your house has the physiognomy of your whole family and of your whole Rogozhin life, end of quote. The room in which Myshkin finds Rogozhin is dominated by a faded portrait of Rogozhin's father, which reveals him to have been an old believer, a group often associated in 19th century Russian culture with business acumen. The portrait, with its, quote, suspicious, secretive, and somewhat doleful gaze, end of quote, reinforces the hostility of the father, the Rogozhins, and the merchant estate to the outside world, to that St. Petersburg that is so rapidly changing around them. The narrator also establishes a link between the Rogozhins and the Skoptsi, a religious sect that practiced voluntary castration. The Rogozhins are the most prominent examples of merchants in the novel. There is another merchant family which plays an important role in Nastasia Filipovna's gathering. There, amidst the succession of shocking deeds and revelations, Myshkin announces to the surprise of everyone present that he too is very rich and can also vie for Nastasia Filipovna's hand in marriage. This is a striking reversal of the earlier depiction of Myshkin. In the first chapters of the novel, he appears to be so removed from economic life that the other characters consider it impossible that he should have any money at all. Yet, as it becomes clear, Myshkin's fortune has come to him by way of a convoluted inheritance. In order to justify the appearance of this new fortune in the novel, the moneylender Ptitsin has to explain the circumstances of Myshkin's unexpected wealth. It takes him a long paragraph to relate all the twists of the story. The reader learns that Myshkin had an aunt, previously unknown to him, who died recently and who was the daughter of a Moscow merchant named Papushin, who himself had died, quote, in poverty and bankruptcy, end of quote. However, it so happened that Papushin had an older brother, also recently deceased, who had a great fortune. In the recent past, both of the rich Papushin's sons had died, leaving him no heirs. Quote, this so shocked the old man that soon afterwards he himself fell ill and died, end of quote. Since this rich merchant was a widower, his only surviving relation was the old woman, Mishkin's aunt, who despite her own illness managed to find Mishkin and make him the beneficiary of her will before becoming the last casualty of this complicated transaction. It seems that the novel strains against its own imperative to plausibility as it attempts to provide Mishkin with his money. 5 people are introduced only to die in the proper succession, and the fatidic force of melodrama has to be deployed in the form of the unknown relation and the sudden inheritance for this fortune of an obscure Moscow merchant to reach Mishkin. Yet, as improbable as his inheritance is, it nonetheless traces a financial and legal link between the prince, ostensibly far removed from the practical side of modern Russian life, and a merchant fortune. As soon as word of Mishkin's unexpected inheritance goes out into the novel's public sphere, which is maintained by a steady exchange of rumors, an article appears about him in, quote, a weekly newspaper of the humoristic sort, end of quote. This parodic paraphrase of Mishkin's story stresses that the source of the fortune was, quote, a relation of his mother, who naturally was of merchant stock, a childless old bachelor, a merchant, bearded, and a schismatic, end of quote. The characteristics of this person, not all of which are apparent from Tsitsin's ostensibly true account of the inheritance, bring him into the same semantic field as Rogozhin's family. Mishkin's money is, according to this article, the product of yet another sterile old believer who stored up his millions in cash without any apparent economic use for them. However surprising and implausible this whole revelation about Mishkin's wealth, it positions him firmly among the novel's merchant characters, and Mishkin will share their common fate. Okay, so much for the merchants. Now for the capitalists. In contrast to the silence with which they make their exit from the novel, the capitalists occupy considerable space in the early chapters, which offer a comprehensive list of their entrepreneurial activities and the sources of their wealth. Both Totsky and Yapanchin are active participants in a distinctly modern economy. Totsky is introduced to the reader as, quote, an arch-capitalist, raskapitalist, a member of companies and societies, end of quote. And the dowry of 75,000 rubles he plans to offer along with Nastasia Filipovna is described as capital on several occasions. The narrator regularly links Totsky and Yapanchin to ultra-modern jargon and capitalist catchphrases. In preparation for Nastasia Filipovna's marriage announcement, Totsky and Yapanchin plan to, quote, exploit Ganya's passion, quote, for their own advantage, пользу, end of quote. The exact nature of Totsky's capitalist activities is evidently less important than their status as markers of his involvement in the world of corporations and stock market wealth. We learn that thanks to his wealth, Totsky has achieved a social status that is out of proportion with the somewhat questionable matter of his noble status. General Yapanchin, the novel's other established capitalist, has likewise benefited from the social mobility made possible by wealth and new business opportunities. The general may indeed be taken as a representative of a nascent Russian entrepreneurial class. Having risen from very modest origins, he belongs to the category of soldiers' children. He has become a respectable member of the middle circle, as his wife Elizaveta Prokofyevna describes the family's milieu. As the reader learns in the novel's first pages, the general derives his wealth from a variety of sources. Quote, and I believe I have this on a slide, which once again I share with you. Here we go. Besides this excellent house, 5/6 of which was rented out, General Yapanchin owned another enormous house on Sadovaya Street, which also brought him an extraordinary income. Besides these two houses, he had quite a profitable and considerable estate just outside Petersburg. And there was also some factory in the Petersburg district. In the old days, General Yapanchin, as everyone knew, had participated in tax farming. Now he participated and had quite a considerable voice in several important joint stock companies. He had the reputation of a man with big money, big doings, and big connections. The narrator observes that it is widely known that the general had in the past participated in the disreputable activity of tax farming, but this fact has apparently not affected his status, and like Trotsky, he has adapted well to the economic and legal conditions of the post-war period. Now, Yapanchin has a large and profitable estate, which he evidently purchased after achieving a degree of prosperity. Besides being a farmer, however, the general is also an industrialist. The narrator displays little interest in the factory the general owns. It is never mentioned again in the novel, and the reader never learns what kind of factory it is. Yet in the novel's fictionalized space, it continues to exist somewhere on the outskirts of St. Petersburg, employing workers and generating profit for the Yapanchins. The business activities of both Trotsky and Yapanchin largely go on behind the scenes of the novel, but they nevertheless link these characters to various aspects of the Russian economy, including industry, agriculture, real estate, and finance. Contrary to the common perception that Dostoevsky's fictions are occupied by people who do not work, these two men are constantly busy, as is their money. At no point in the novel does the money of the capitalists take on the densely material quality of Rogozhin's cash. Instead, it seamlessly links together the varied business activities into sources of income, and in its invisible traces helps to map Russia as an economy. So we see that there are two categories of rich men in this novel. On one side are the merchants, some of Dostoevsky's most vivid and memorable characters, two men with profound interiorities and dramatic stories. On the side of the capitalists, we find two men to whom the narrator does not even deign to give first names. I think he does actually give a first name to Trotsky, but certainly not General Yapanchin. The wealth of the merchants is shocking and disruptive. Rogozhin's money and its refusal to burn seems to flaunt its materiality. Of course, the capitalists too have their physical assets, but these, like the some sort of factory that Yapanchin owns, are always somewhere else, beyond the reaches of the narrative. At the end of the novel, the two merchants are banished from European Russia and silenced. On the other hand, the capitalists make a quiet and orderly exit, with every indication that they will go on doing business, now freed from the scandalous excesses of Nastasia Philippovna, Rogozhin, and Mishkin. So a few words now in conclusion. I'd like to bring up a couple of reasons why I think all of this matters. The first is that by focusing on the flows of money in this novel rather than on its ethics, metaphysics, or theology, which have attracted the greatest share of critical attention, I return to the concerns of some of the novel's early readers. For example, in my next slide is a poem that appeared in the satirical journal The Spark in response to the publication of the first part of the novel. In your pocket, poor man, a penny has a place of honor and a big one, while in the ingenious novel, millions are worth nothing. We Slavs endure cold in our homes not for the first month, while in the wondrous novel, they stoke fireplaces with money. Minaev's poem ridicules the punitive realism of Dostoevsky's novel for its obliviousness to the real concerns of ordinary Russians. But perhaps these fireplaces stoked with money are not quite so divorced from reality, even if they are exaggerations of it. Indeed, I think that what makes the economic subplot of The Idiot so important is that it raises basic questions about the realist novel's ability to give aesthetic form to an increasingly confusing modernity in which the future was not evenly distributed. The problem that The Idiot confronts is how to say anything about invisible economic operations which wind their way around an older economic system that seems solid and concrete. Can the representational capacities of the realist novel be adequate to the task of making capitalism comprehensible or legible? The ending of The Idiot suggests that they are not. The systemic defeat of the merchants by the capitalists leaves the economic world of the idiot open to the conquest of the latter. And this has profound consequences for the continued representation of this fictional world. The economic power that Trotsky and Yapanchin wield is mostly invisible, as is their money, and their triumph shifts the novel's economy into a mode from which little empirical data can be extracted. Like Yapanchin's factory and Trotsky's estate, the financial operations of the capitalists remain largely invisible in the novel. Most significant in this respect is the two capitalists' eventual withdrawal into an altogether new temporality, in which, by the narrator's own recognition, very little happens that can be told. A number of commentators on the representational capacities of the novel have developed the idea that the structure of time in modernity leads to a kind of narrative impasse. Walter Benjamin wrote of the homogeneous empty time of modernity, of the bare chronology in which every moment is exactly as meaningless as the last. Georg Lukács, borrowing the Hegelian concept of bad infinity to label the dead-end descriptive operations of literary naturalism, which end up endlessly affirming the merely existent. More recently, both Franco Moretti and Ilya Kliger in different contexts have written about the unnarratability of business or of the career, kinds of activity which, unlike the literarily more fruitful possibilities offered by artistic creation or revolutionary politics, stretch off into an infinity of undifferentiated blandness. On the other hand, as Anne Lounsbury has argued, capitalist activity finds novelistic expression as consummate narrativity in some cases, as a pure succession of events, or even as a mere list of places visited. Where all these readings agree is that capitalist activity generates a form of time that is not particularly fertile ground for interesting storytelling. I think then that nothing worth telling happens to anyone at the end of The Idiot precisely because we now find ourselves in the time of capital. The fascinating merchants have served their purpose. For a while, their money was vividly legible as the struggle between merchants. Sorry, let me repeat that. The economy was vividly legible as the struggle between merchants with their indestructible money and the discrete capitalists in their invisible assets. Now that struggle is over, the capitalists have won, and the invisible operations of their capital, rather than the spectacular materiality of the merchant's cash, will structure time. In this new phase of Russia's economic life, the novel falls silent. In contrast to so many accounts, both in the 19th century and in the present day, that stress alternatively the dynamism, the creativity, or the violence of capitalism, The Idiot posits that a fully capitalist world is one in which nothing can happen and about which nothing can be said. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Vadim. This was really wonderful and given me so many ideas about The Idiot and why The Idiot is the way it is. So as I said before at the beginning, if you have a question for Vadim, you are welcome to either raise your hand or write it in the Q&A. The raise hand feature and the Q&A are available at the base of the Zoom window for attendees. And we have 5 minutes for questions, but then we can run over about 5 minutes as well, I think. So I have a question to get us started, which is, I'm really struck by the idea of these invisible forces that are shaping the novel. And I know that throughout Dostoevsky's work, we see other invisible forces that kind of indicate modernity and crop up in other novels, as well as The Idiot. So another example of this, we have capitalism. Another example of this would be, for example, ideologies, right, that we have in Demons, for example, or Crime and Punishment, the idea of the invisible idea. And I'm trying to think of other invisible forces that shape novels, right? And I'm wondering if you find that capitalism in particular holds a special place within Dostoevsky's work, or if capitalism becomes just one amongst these many systems that shape modernity within the works.
Thank you, Kaja, for that question. I think that it is I'm glad that you've put capitalism as an invisible force into the context of Dostoevsky's other invisible forces, because I agree there are a number of these that animate Dostoevsky's novels and that have, I think, very different kind of narrative and representational consequences. I do agree that it's intriguing to think about capitalism as one of several of these forces, where I find what I find is special about capitalism as a narrative problem is maybe not so much in its own invisibility as in the strategies that Dostoevsky's novels undertake to try to make it part of the story. And that is where the capitalist invisible forces come into contact, into collision with the other side of Dostoevsky's economic imaginary, which is the one that has drawn the most attention, which is the spectacularly material side of things, where people sew money up into little pouches that they wear around their necks, or they bury it under rocks. They don't do things with it that we would expect them to do. And so it seems that there are these two extreme poles. One, money is so concrete you can't do anything with it because it doesn't even work as money anymore. You can't exchange it for things. On the other hand, is this completely invisible dimension. Some scholars have kind of explained this by saying that Dostoevsky himself didn't really understand the complex operations of the stock market in his time, these sorts of things. But whatever kind of the external explanation for it, within Dostoevsky's novel, the effect is that economic transactions take on one of these two extreme forms. And what I find in The Idiot in particular, I don't want to generalize from here to all of Dostoevsky's novels, but in The Idiot in particular, this seems to lead, again in my interpretation, to ultimately a rather strange strange narrative resolution that is rather pessimistic about what the novel will be able to say about all of this economic development once this period of sort of non-synchronicity has come to an end.
This is so interesting. I know I've read obviously Jillian Porter's book, and I've read Jonathan's book. Jonathan's here, by the way. And I've read your book, and I've read all of these books that kind of try to classify or consider Dostoevsky's economic imaginary in different ways. And I find it, for some reason, it only just occurred to me that there are these two extremes, right? There's the invisible capital, and then there's the money that doesn't really function as money. But I hadn't put those two things together before. And one thing that's really striking to me is that Dostoevsky himself was really terrible with money. So I'm wondering, like, I mean, if Dostoevsky has money, I'm guessing it is the type that doesn't really function as money, right? It is the money that is hidden under a rock. It is the money that is sewn up in someone's bed. It is the money that is stashed in a pouch that you may or may not be using, but it hangs like a guilty weight around you, right? Or what Dostoevsky was doing with his own money, which was gambling it away, pawning things to get more money, stashing the money, gambling it away, right? But capital becomes something kind of insidious in this sense, right? It becomes almost apocalyptic because it's invisible. So it's like these systems that people like Dostoevsky can't quite tap into, but he sees the people around him tapping into them. And I wonder what you think about that. Does that make sense as a reading, or is that a little too tied to biography?
I think that reading has, there are certainly some things to recommend that reading. It is tied to the Dostoevsky's biography, but I don't think that invalidates it. If we think of the way that Dostoevsky, the historical existing person, was entangled in debts. His own works, his own texts were kind of also entangled in those financial problems that Dostoevsky had. He was at risk of losing republication rights to his works because he was in debt to a predatory publisher and these sorts of things. So it does seem like on the one hand he faces these situations where his uses of money lead to such things as gambling everything away. On the other hand, his own intellectual property is threatened by these financial entanglements. But the other thing that this leads me to think about, and this is tangential to my talk, but I think important to bring up, is that when Dostoevsky does kind of think in more abstract, more speculative terms about economic forces, sometimes that takes a kind of conspiratorial turn. And I think that one place where this makes contact with another dimension of Dostoevsky's thought is in his propensity for anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. The notion of the Jews as a state within a state, as he writes about in his journalism. And this kind of understanding of capitalism as conspiracy theory, as another kind of network of invisible forces, suggests that there is a kind of interpretive framework coming together here. But of course, it's not one that either belongs to any kind of mainstream economic thought of the 19th century, rather, I should say, of Dostoevsky's own time, or certainly of those more familiar interpretive patterns like Marxist thought, which only comes later. And even if Dostoevsky weren't so antithetical to those ideas, would not have been available to him. But it is, I think it is going back to your earlier comment, the way that this kind of invisible force connects to others in his work and his thought is quite interesting to think about.
Thank you. Okay, so we have a couple of questions coming up in the chat. First is Robin Miller, who asks, could you talk a bit about Petitsin, the only positively represented moneylender I can think of in Dostoevsky's fiction?
Good question, Robin. I'm glad you asked that, because I kind of think, I think Petitsin is really the closest thing to a positively represented moneylender that I can think of in Dostoevsky's fiction as well. Let's see, what can I say about him that's interesting in the next couple of minutes? I confess that I probably can't say very much that's interesting about him right now. I haven't honestly given enough thought to Petitsin, except in his role within the part of the idiot that I've been talking about as the ostensibly reliable source of this additional information about Myshkin's relatives. I need to think more about what Petitsin on his own is doing in the novel. But I appreciate you bringing that up, Robin.
And Jonathan, we have a question from Jonathan as well. This is Jonathan Payne. Jonathan had his hand up earlier, but I think then he wrote his question in the chat. And his question is, could you perhaps discuss the issue of money as a signifier of value, both of the relative value of characters, for example, Nastasia Filipovna or Myshkin, and of the value of the text itself? And Robin adds that she would love to talk with you about Petitsin at some point.
Great. Yeah, thanks for that question, Jonathan. Let's see, money as a signifier of value, both the relative value of characters and of the value of the text itself. So let me see how to organize my response here. This is certainly another dimension of money, about another dimension of how money functions in Dostoevsky's novels and in The Idiot. Let's see. In the major question here, that's kind of the center at the center of my talk that I haven't mentioned a whole lot is, of course, Nastasia Filipovna herself. And there are a lot of really interesting questions that are connected to Nastasia Filipovna's value as a character, as an object of desire for these other characters, but in terms of her own place in this novel. And number of commentators have, of course, talked about how her absences are very significant in structuring the idiot's form, and her elusiveness, the inability of other characters or of the novel to grasp her, to give an adequate account of her, together with the inability of other characters to assign an adequate monetary value to her. Their constant negotiations of larger and larger sums of these incommensurable kinds of money. It seems to me, this is a really rich question. I'm offering a very off the top of my head kind of response, but more than anything else in this novel, I think Nastasia Filipovna illustrates the inability of money to express value within the narrative world of the idiot. There are these different kinds of money. They come in increasingly fanciful sums. None of it, Nastasia Filipovna rejects all of it. None of it seems to be kind of adequate to calculate her significance. The money either is kind of too abstract, or it's this impossibly concrete money that can't be used for anything. So that's what I can say in the couple of minutes that I have.
Thank you, Vadim. And we have one more question in the chat, which will be the last question, which comes from Fred van Hortsen. Based on Winter Notes on Summer Impressions, would you characterize Dostoevsky as one of the first anti-globalists?
That's a great question. I'm inclined to say that tentatively yes. I suppose that one could characterize Dostoevsky as one of the first anti-globalists. As far as his hostility in Winter Notes to Summer Impressions, not only to Europe as something that can remain external to Russia, but also in the sense, and I don't have a great recollection of the text, but I seem to remember that one of the main problems that he has with the West as he undertakes his train journey is its remarkable homogeneity. And one of the reasons for that homogeneity is because of the train travel itself. The speed with which the train traverses this distance kind of makes everything the same, flattens it, makes it kind of an undifferentiated kind of boringness that clearly Dostoevsky finds difficult to live with. And if Europe is the source of technological and financial modernity, and one of the effects of these technologies is to homogenize, to flatten, to render everything into this fungible mass, then this is certainly something that Dostoevsky seems to be very much opposed to, in favor of particularity and difference and incommensurability. So that's one side of what undoubtedly is a much richer question that I would love to think about more.
In the chat, we also have a special message from your son, who is the youngest member of the audience, Vadim, who wants to say great talk. And I agree, this was a great talk. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you very much, Vadim. I so appreciate this deeply contextualized reading of The Idiot and of Dostoevsky's works generally. And I really think that The Idiot is such a strange novel. And I love the way that no matter, it seems to me, no matter which way we look at it, from which perspective, it is a novel that is deeply about the problems of representation, right? The problems of how to depict life and all of these invisible forces, all of these aspects of life that are not depictable. And I think that your talk has really shed light on a new way of looking at that in a really productive way. And so thank you so much. And
absolutely, thank you for having me here.
My pleasure.
Thank you to Mir for listening to a talk which has occupied a significant portion of his life. And thank you all for your questions and comments and for listening. It's a pleasure to be here.